So we know that melters, flamers and heavy bolters are all getting significantly better, so what units might be scary after these new changes? Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, the strategy focused 40k channel where we're all about getting the most out of our miniatures on the tabletop. So it's been a week or so since Games Workshop announced these statline changes to some of the most iconic Imperial armaments, which I think Games Workshop targeted at things like heavy bolters, melters and flamers to make them feel a little bit more powerful and deadly on the tabletop, as throughout most of 8th edition most of these haven't really been all that exciting. Melters and flamers in particular tended to be fairly suboptimal options, and with the new buffs there's a fair few units that might well shine that rely on these weapons but weren't all that strong in the previous edition. There is the small question as to whether or not these weapons will go up in points cost to reflect their new abilities, but if I'd had to guess I'd probably say they're likely not to. Multi-melters already went up from their 8th edition points cost, where it was fairly universally agreed that they weren't all that good for the points cost in 8th, and were just outperformed by things like las cannons. Heavy bolters have remained the same on infantry platforms and gone up 5 points on vehicles, which again to my mind, unless that was accounting for the damage too, then it would have been a pretty weird change. I certainly wouldn't be taking 15 point heavy bolters if they were just damage 1 if I could avoid it. So for this video I'm going to assume that they will be staying the same price, and I will certainly be covering the actual changes when they come out in that FAQ that they talked about. In any case, let's go through a few of the units that I think are going to be nicely buffed by these changes. So first of all we have multi-melters, going from 1 shot to flat 2 shots, and also having the melter range rule buffed where they're within 12 inches they'll be getting d6 plus 2 damage. Seems very strong indeed for 25 points, when they basically cost almost the same points as las cannons. Las cannons were always my preferred go-to for the extra range and strength. For me, now they're 25 points on vehicles and las cannons are 20 points, I think multi-melters will be the go-to most of the time. Slightly different battlefield role, but in general I would prefer to have 24-inch range and double the shots over the extra range and strength. The extra AP and melter rule are just icing on the cake really. Now there's plenty of units that use multi-melters in 40k. In particular I think sisters will do well out of this, particularly their retributor squads, who could be very scary indeed, piling out of transport or out of strategic reserve and then laying down 8 melter shots into the enemy. I think that the sisters will be particularly potent with those sort of weapons because they have access to miracle dice, and you could use the melter weapons to get some automatic very high damage results through on enemy tanks. Multi-melter immolators are going to be far more scary now. They're basically going to have the firepower of some main battle tanks. At least they're a little bit more resistant to being locked up in close combat, as they can still blaze away with the multi-melters there. For the Imperial Guard, it makes things like multi-melter tank sponsons on Leman Russes and tank commanders a bit more viable. Though still, if you are buying 2 of them, that will be an extra 50 points on your tank, which means while it's getting a lot more threatening, it is a lot less durable point for point. And we might also see the hull-mounted version run on Hellhounds a bit more. I wonder if they're going to buff the melter cannon of the Devil Dog, seeing as that'll have almost the exact same damage output as a multi-melter now. For the Space Wolves, the Storm Wolf or Stormfang gunships can take multi-melter sponsons and take them in pairs, so again a very expensive upgrade there at 100 points for the sponsons, but it will be weighing down at a pretty ludicrous 8 anti-tank shots at close range, and with the good movement it's likely to be able to get there. That's before you take into account its Hellfrost weaponry. I think possibly one of the units that might most emerge as very competitive are these Mephitic Blight Haulers you can see on the right. These guys are already making the rounds and Death Guard lists at the moment, and like all Nurgle demon engines they're a real pain to remove. They seem to be seeing play already with just their missile launcher and multi-melter shot, in addition to their lower strength closer range weapons, but just adding another flat extra shot on top of a unit that's already quite good is a recipe for them being played a lot. I honestly think that these guys could be one of the default demon engine go-tos for Death Guard after the change. For Death Guard and the rest of Chaos, Hellbrutes with multi-melters might see a bit more play. I think quite a few people have a multi-melter Hellbrute in their collection from the Dark Vengeance box set from a couple of editions ago, and now that gun's arguably one of the strongest choices for them, I think they'll see a lot more play. Of course, Space Marines have absolutely tons of access to multi-melters. It's going to be interesting to see what shakes out as the strongest between Land Speeders, Attack Bikes and Invader ATVs, all of which pretty much fill the exact same tactical role. In particular, Attack Bikes with multi-melters at 55 points a pop seem just incredibly scary. They're not all that tough, but that's a ton of close-range anti-tank firepower, in addition to good mobility and even some anti-infantry firepower from the twin bolt guns. We might see some multi-melter drop pods competing with the Grav Devastator drop pods that seem to be seeing play a lot. Land Raiders just are a tiny bit buffed from that multi-melter on the top being a bit more viable. Again, Dreadnoughts with a multi-melter could be a bit more competitive compared with the twin las cannons. And the new Space Marine Gladiator tank appears to have some multi-melter sponsons as well. Theoretically, that thing could be putting out 8 close-range anti-tank shots between its turret-mounted las cannon and those sponsons. In particular, and perhaps slightly unfortunately, the Salamanders are really going to enjoy this change. They will be the strongest users of multi-melters from the Space Marine arsenal, and it doesn't bode particularly well seeing as they're one of the strongest armies in 40k right now. It really is a good time to be a descendant of Vulcan. Moving on, let's talk about 12-inch flamers. Now this is a change that I really quite liked, as I really wasn't much of a fan of flamers in 8th edition, barring a few specific examples. Basically, flamers are going to be going from 8 inches to 12-inch range, which is pretty powerful for any just starting on the board. They're more likely to get in range. It's also really good for anything coming out of reserve, which means that the flamers can actually shoot when they come out of reserve, when previously they couldn't. And it's also a handy little buff for Overwatch as well. Should you choose to fire it, your opponent can't do the tactic of just charging from outside 8-inch range now, knowing that your flamers aren't going to be able to hit them. I do have a few more questions for this though. I noticed that hand flamers went to 5 points per model, which looks like a pretty serious nerf when they were 1 point per model before, and they weren't always taken then. They were only 6-inch range before, so I'm not sure whether they would get the buff to go to 12 inches or not. We'll have to wait and see. If they did, then they'd still potentially be a little expensive for what they did, but at least there'd just be a little bit more reason to take them. It'll also be similar as to whether or not other Chaos and Xenos weapons get the same 12-inch flamer treatment, as there's a lot of auto-hitting flamer-style weapons that have 8-inch range, a random number of shots and auto-hit, that aren't actually necessarily called flamers. For example, the Plague Sprayer of the Noxious Blightbringer. That one's only 9 inches. It'll be interesting to see whether or not that gets updated to 12. I think probably Games Workshop's intention will be that they all will be. For example, the Triarch Stalker's Heat Ray from the Necrons, that can be fired on essentially a heavy flamer profile, and that one did go up from 8 inches to 12-inch range, so there's at least some hope. In any case, with the changes to vehicles being able to fire with weapons in close combat, flamers were already beginning to see a bit of play in 9th edition, in one particular place on Imperial Guard Chimeras. I generally felt that heavy flamer chimeras were a bit of a liability in 8th edition, just because they could get locked up, maybe be out of range all game, and then maybe be locked up and unable to fire when they actually got to the enemy. Now you're pretty much guaranteed to get that damage off, even if you get tagged in close combat. Heavy flamers are looking like a really decent alternative to heavy bolters, particularly because of guard ballistic skill being only 4+. Some of the stronger guard lists at the moment have been running a bunch of infantry squads in dual heavy flamer chimeras, providing a very durable and at least slightly threatening unit to go and capture objectives with. Otherwise, they are looking far more viable on Lehman Russ tank sponsons, though I am a little bit questionable as to whether or not you want to be getting the Russes on combat anyway, particularly if they're carrying blast weapons. The range boost to the hull-mounted weapon on the Hellhound will be helpful to synergize a bit better with the long range of the turrets, and flamers and heavy flamers on infantry squads should be more viable than ever, particularly seeing as they also got a points drop on them. Maybe we'll see a few more flamer armed command squads in lists like Kaschans. For the Sisters, a few of their units already had 12-inch range flamers, such as Retributors and the Immolator. It could certainly help add any heavy flamers hidden within squads though, and flamers on Dominions and things. But I think that some of the biggest winners are Penitent Engines and Mortifiers. They're locked into them, they seem to be fairly good choices point for point now, and having just that little bit of extra threat range will lead to more chances to fire the heavy flamers over the course of the game. For Chaos, Thousand Sun Warp Flamers and Noise Marine Doom Sirens could look a bit more interesting after the change, obviously presuming they get it, and Wraithguard D-Sides could be worth a second look as well, particularly as they could pop up out of nowhere and then auto-hit the enemy quite a lot with Strength 10 weapons. For Space Marines, I think that the biggest impact will be being able to drop into the enemy and hit them from reserve. Flamestorm aggressors, particularly in Salamanders, are ludicrously scary, and if they could turn up out of strategic reserve on a flank or something, then they can pretty much just auto-delete virtually any unit they can get those flamer weapons to bear on when they stack a few strats. Another option could be Sternguard veterans in a drop pod, which would be quite nice after the 2 wound change as well. Being able to pile out and blaze away with both flamers and bolters, again potentially with Salamanders with +1 to wound on the flamer profile, and maybe using the stratagem to get max shots, could be a very nice and easy way to clear screens out of Deep Strike, and potentially not even need the long-range Marksman successor chapter trait to make that work. We might also see a few more incidental heavy flamers around, such as say on Terminator squads, where they're just a little bit more viable on the Deep Strike now. Over for the Grey Knights, it might potentially mean that Incinerators could catch up a bit with the other special weapon choices. Being able to flame out of Deep Strike and teleport is certainly something the Grey Knights will enjoy. And if the Deathwatch Frag Cannon gets the change as well, then I think it's safe to say that we'll be seeing a lot more of those in Deathwatch lists too. The potential for 2d6 strength 6 hits out of Deep Strike is just something that's incredibly scary indeed. Finally, we come on to Damage 2 Heavy Bolters. which I'll admit I'm a little bit more on the fence about as to whether they're worth it for the vehicle profile at 15 points. They're certainly very generalist, and they will pretty much damage whatever unit that you point them at in the game, and that's certainly a positive. It means that any heavy bolters can just be pointed at the threats that you most want to die. Paying a little bit extra for them and going to damage 2 has made them worse at being anti-light infantry though, where now you'll just be paying more points for the heavy bolter and you'll be wasting the damage too, but it does mean they're pretty good for hunting space marines and other 2-wound infantry. They might see a bit of a new relevance when all the marines get their 2-wound update. I feel that if there are any efficient infantry platforms for heavy bolters, then that is going to be a big jump between the 10 points it costs on them rather than the 15 points on vehicles. It's proportionately quite a lot. In general, I feel like heavy bolters are rarely going to be the wrong choice, but they're just not all that specialised, and it kind of remains to be seen whether entire armies of them are going to work. I suspect if we see them work anywhere, it might be with the Imperial Fist chapter tactics for those extra hits on 6s. They are the chapter that pretty much loves the heavy bolter, seeing as they have a great Devastator doctrine for some excellent anti-tank fire with them turn 1, and also a little bit of extra AP as well, meaning that they should have an absolutely excellent alpha strike if you have lots of heavy bolters in the list. For guard, I think it just means that we don't have to feel bad about taking heavy bolter sponsons anymore. I would still say they're pretty much in the take or leave category, as opposed to definitely wanting them literally wherever you can get them. I think they still have the potential to be used on things like chimeras and hull-mounted weapons of chimera chassis vehicles. Could think about some Valkyrie door gunners, and one interesting super heavy that might be worth a mention is the Malkador Defender, seeing as that thing packs 7 heavy bolters. If you want lots of heavy bolters in a guard list, then that could be one way to go. For the sisters, I think potentially the most interesting unit with heavy bolters are Mortifiers. They're really quite cheap and incredibly dangerous in close combat, and you could have an absolute ton of them in the list if you wanted to. Say if you had 9 of these, then you could be blazing away with 54 heavy bolter shots a turn, all the while having a massive melee threat moving up the board. Of course, heavy bolters are absolutely everywhere in the Chaos and Standard Marine army list. Probably some of the most efficient ways of putting heavy bolters on the tables are these rapier carriers that you can see on the right, or Devastators or Havocs. Of course, they can crop up all over the place, including Devastator Centurions, Land Raider Twin Heavy Bolters, Razorbacks, Predators, and many, many more. I think heavy bolters are rarely going to be a wrong choice, but might suffer slightly from being jack of all trades, masters of none, besides maybe a slight lean to being able to kill Space Marines a bit better. Maybe when 2-wounded Marines really do start to take off in earnest, they'll be taken even more. So those are a few ideas for units that might get better with the Melta, Flamer and Heavy Bolter changes. If you can think of anything more for your specific faction, then please let me know down in the comments below. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to the channel. Here on Auspex Tactics, we have regular 40k stuff like this coming out pretty much every day. If you have been enjoying my videos, I'd just like to mention that the channel has a Patreon page, which is how I can afford to keep them coming quite so regularly. If you are enjoying, then any support is massively appreciated. Channel Patrons do get to see a video per week early. There's regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and you're also automatically entered into the Auspex Tactics prize giveaway, which happens once a month with some big kits. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support the channel, then the link is down in the video description below. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.